about challenges in cruise, and this graph shows now the passenger cruise sector, which is in terms of tonnage as well as number of ships rather small, but it is showing a considerable growth. And I would say during the last few years, because this statistics is up to 2008, and the growth of the cruise sector is going up very much. So, as I said, relatively few number of ships. So this is the world fleet numbers for passenger ships, and we'll see also later on that passenger ships, of course, is not only cruise, but it's all sorts of ferries and small boats for transportation of people, and people and cargo, etc., and so on. But for instance, we have some very large ones, 95 in number. Tonnage not so very big, but anyway, quite a few in this size. And of course, as you go down to medium size, there are thousands of ships that carry passengers. So altogether, of course, it's very important, and it's also important when it comes to safety, because we have people on board. We have lots of people on board. So a passenger ship, not only is expensive when you buy it, or it's expensive to build, but the cargo on board is of high value, right? That's what we think about ourselves, that we are of high value. The value of people, of course, is somewhat different in different countries. But let's say in developed countries, we are talking about several $1 million for a person is worth several $1 million. And when you have, of course, thousands of people on board, the cargo is extremely valuable. And this is in gross ton, and remember the different types of ton. Gross ton, it has to do with volume. Deadweight is not very important or relevant for a passenger ship. It's really the volume of the ship as expressed by the gross tonnage. And again, now you can see how much tonnage there are of different sizes of passenger ships. So, nothing that you really have to remember, but it is an important sector of shipping. But this is quite interesting. If you look at gross tonnage compared to price when you buy or build a ship. And of course the cheapest ones are bulk carriers, which is kind of a bucket on the sea, if I may be a little bit loose in my characterization here. And tankers too, it's kind of a barrel on the sea. And then, of course, if you get into container vessels, the price kind of doubles compared to tankers and bulks. And then you have ro-ro and ro-packs, cruise ships, fast ferry. But you see cruise ships, you know, let's say if you go into the largest cruise ships, and you see $1,000,000,000. So that's $1 billion for a very large cruise ship. So the value is tremendous. And of course, if you compare the value of a cruise ship of this size compared with a tanker or bulk carrier, you see you can get many ships of this type for one of those. So it is a high value market segment. And if you look at the tradition of building cruise ships, it's mainly been happening in Europe. Originally, quite a bit in Great Britain. Nowadays, we have Finland, where you find SDX Europe, that used to be Aker Yards. You have Germany, the Meyer-Werke in Bremen. You have France, Chantier d'Atlantique, and you have cruise building yards in Italy. But there are relatively few, and it is a special skill to build a cruise ship. And that is why probably Korea has not been, or any other country in Asia has not been successful so far. And I hope by the end of this lecture that you will understand why. But you can see here that the size of these cruise ships have been going up, right? And one can wonder what the limitation is. But for instance, for these, the passenger capacity is more than 6,000 passengers. It's enormous. It's a floating city. And is it going to end? I don't know. What happened to the tankers when they got to be 600,000 tons? They became too big, really, for most ports, right? And of course, also there were problems with just the size in terms of strength. And I think when it comes to these cruise ships, the size really will be determined by the market. Do people really want to be on board a ship with, let's say, 10,000 passengers? I'm not so sure. Okay. So how much is the transport capacity, so to speak? How many cruise passengers are there? And you see in year 2009, 13 million. That's quite a few people. And forecast for 2010, 14.3. So there is a considerable growth in spite of a little bit difficult economical times, right? So, but there will be considerable growth in the time to come. And high value, as I've repeatedly said. Main cruise areas. One can divide the Earth into different sectors. You have Arctic cruising and Antarctic cruising. You have the South Americas, Pacific. Alaska is a big destination. You have Greenland. You have the Caribbean and the islands, Bahamas and so on. Africa is not so big. Indian Ocean is not so big. Asia is not so big. Oceania is not so big. But Europe is big, and Mediterranean in particular. So that you can see the different. Let's see, what do we have? It's kind of hard to read, isn't it? Yeah, this is the size, and these are the big cruise companies: Carnival Cruises and Royal Caribbean Cruise Lines, Star, etc. Yes. Panama. Yeah, there are quite a few cruise ships that go through the Panama Canal. And it's normally combined with cruise to Mexico, Cancun, and places like that. And you know, you have these very, very big cruise ships. They obviously cannot go through the Panama Canal, but you have a lot of cruise ships that are exactly 32.2 meters wide. And why is that? They are designed to go through this Panama Canal. But, you know, they are now widening the Panama Canal. So it will be, is it 46 or 48 meters wide? I don't remember. But it's close to 50 meters wide in about 2 years. And that will change shipping. We are going to have a new class of what is called Panmax, maximum size for going through the Panama Canal. So that will be not 32.2, but it will be close to 48 meters or something like that. That means that we'll have other cruise ships going through here, and of course that kind of opened the range for travel by sea altogether. So that will be very interesting. It's an extremely important development, what's happening in Panama. Asian and Korean market. Number of passengers as high as 200,000. Of course, it's not very high. But 150 international arrivals. So, you know, this kind of cruise traffic is now developing. But I think this comparison that I put up here is interesting. Population, North America has 350 million. Greater Europe has 550 million. And Greater Asia has 3.5 billion. Right? And of course, the standard of living is increasing very rapidly in China and Korea, India, Vietnam, etc. So I'm quite sure that in the future there will be a tremendous development in Asia. So at least, as it says here, the growth potential is tremendous. This is one that when you are going to do in your projects also, if you are going to work with ships, you know, you have to write up what factors are the most important factors, right? And so key performance indicator, that means factors that are important when it comes to building and operating ships. So it's the construction, the drivers, the design, standard solutions, modular construction, and networking of suppliers, and construction efficiency, and building cost. And then you have payload function. Well, it's like capacity, and when it comes to a cruise ship, it's of course the number of paying passengers. Speed and power. Cargo units, not important. Cargo handling, well, if you call the people cargo, how you handle the people, of course, is also important when you have a big logistics problem. So it's a money-making potential. Ship functions, well, hull form maybe in terms of design, but it's really safety more than anything that is important for cruise. So that's why I've circled, building cost, transport capacity, safety, and as we are going to see more and more, the environmental performance, because people are conscious about the environment, and also regulations are becoming much stricter. Smoke emissions, waste, sewage, ballast, you don't have ballast water problems. Wake and noise in particular. Recycling and scrapping, probably not so much to worry about. But cruise is a particular type of shipping, and you see those circles are particularly important. And the comfort, and we'll come back to that, what does it feel like being on board? And of course, when you go on a cruise, it's the experience. It's, so to speak, how much fun do you have when you are on a cruise ship? Americans tend to translate fun into dollars, but how they do that, I'm not sure. The International Maritime Organization, and note this one. This is, safety by design. The ship is the best lifeboat. What does that mean? It's safer to be on the ship than going down into the big waves in a small boat, right? And if you're going to evacuate 5,000 people, can you imagine what kind of chaos that will create? And in order to make the ship itself, let's say, the best lifeboat, it has to be divided into zones where you kind of control. If you have a damage, you limit the damage to a certain part of the ship. So, and there's a limit where you can return to port, right? If the ship is not totally too much damaged, then you'll be able to return to port. If you can't, then you have to evacuate. And you see, in order to be able to stay on the ship, you have to be able to control certain factors, and it is fire, and that is really very dangerous, of course, on a passenger ship. So you have fire zones, and you have ways of dealing with fire safety. And of course, damage stability. If you have a collision, or you collide with an iceberg or whatever, you have to have what is called compartments, where you have bulkheads that prevents water from filling into the hull. So there's a 2-compartment standard, there's a 3-compartment standard. What does that mean? That means if you have an accident, how many of these compartments, these divisions in the ship hull can you allow to be flooded? Right? So, for instance, a 3-compartment standard implies that even if 3 compartments are filled with water, the ship will not capsize. So it will be safe. So that's very, very important to have these divisions within the hull. And there's also an index that I'll get a little bit back to, so you have some theory around this. Redundant power, emergency generator demanded. So you have to you always have to have extra power if the main engine goes down. And what we are seeing now in modern cruise ships is that the machinery has to be divided into 2 or more compartments. Now I'll give you some examples of that, what it really means. And there has to be several propulsion units. So that is several engines and propellers. But if this is not good enough and the ship has to be evacuated, that's where the casualty threshold, the limit has been exceeded. Then the existing rule is 75% in lifeboats, and there should be an additional 50% capacity for rafts, the inflatable rafts. But there can be other alternatives, larger boats, and when you have a very large cruise ship, that is an alternative. Yeah. So, to underline that this is a serious topic, I have this list of major ship catastrophes, and I'm sure there are more. And if you go to this web page here, you'll see a much more extensive list of major ship catastrophes. And these, of course, do not include casualties during war. During war, there have been some extremely bad things happening at sea, of course. Thousands of people have gone down. But there are some very famous ones. And I'll talk a little bit about Titanic. The historical perspective of Titanic. And there's another accident that was 15 years ago with Estonia. That is a passenger, it's a ferry, but it's almost like a cruise ship. So there have been written many books about Titanic. I'll just show this on one slide. This is the famous Captain Smith. It hit an iceberg, and what happened was exactly what I just was talking about, compartments. The iceberg tore open the side of the ship, and let's say, I don't know exactly how many compartments were filled, but I think it was 3 or 4, and it went down. And of course, evacuation in very cold water, dark, etc. So very many people lost their lives. And the captain also tried to set a new speed record across the Atlantic, which didn't really help, did it? when they discovered there were icebergs floating in the water. So I'm not sure if you have seen the movie. It's quite realistic, but of course it's a movie. But I think this is interesting because, part of the problem with Titanic, it had single skin. It, had only one layer of steel. And of course, when this iceberg opened it almost like a can, with a can opener, so much water came into the hull. And what they say is also with Titanic that they should have continued with rather high speed rather than stopping the engines. That certainly did not help. But there's a famous engineer, Brunel. He was, among other things, he planned the subway, the world's first subway in London. But he was a great engineer, and he designed this ship that was called the Great Eastern, built around 1850. The first double-skin ship. He was a very smart person. He realized that if he was going to have great safety on his ship, he needed to have two barriers against the water, right? So it was 60 years, more than 60 years before Titanic, he was thinking about this. And as you can see, it was a combination of a steamship and had sails. But it was revolutionary in the sense that it was a big ship that was operated with steam engines and paddle wheels. So, good thinking. But, things are not all that easy today either. Look at these pictures. They are real pictures. And of course there are many cases where the people have been damaged on board during severe storms. And they have to be built for the most severe weather, including freak waves. When you look at this picture, obviously they are heading towards the sea, but that's what they have to do. If they were, let's say, lost power and were lying in this direction, right, and you had the waves from the sides, can you imagine what it would be like to be on board? Hopefully it would not sink, but it's very, very dangerous.
I have a question there.
Yeah.
Actually, my major job in my company.
Yes.
I conducted the safety analysis to the official issue.
Mm-hmm.
For example, we investigate some the individual risk level. Individual risk level. For example, expressed by fatality.
Fatalities.
Fatality in
Yeah.
the official level.
Yeah.
But for usually for the official platform, the individual risk level, between the 10 to minus 3 per year.
Yes.
Yeah. But it is
You did cruise ships?
Yeah, there are some guidelines.
Yeah.
Or the similar
Yeah. Yeah. Yes. And, well, I think offshore one normally talks about 10 to the minus 4.
Yeah.
And I had some colleagues in DNV who did safety analysis of cruise ships, and they did not come out very well. No.
But I have heard some the research work maybe conducted by DNV for the development of the formal safety assessment.
Yeah, FSA.
Various types.
Yes.
For the technical or for the cruise ship.
Yes.
They to some of this consistent.
Yes, yes. Well, but you know, if you look at the probability of losing lives, of course, one reason why you really have to think about it is that you have so many people on board, right? What we are doing with modern ships, we are trying to reduce the number of crew as much as possible for economical reasons, but as a matter of fact, it does increase the safety in relation to loss of life. Of course, if you have a crew of 12, as compared with a crew of 24, the loss potential is only half, right? Well, then of course one might argue that 24 people on board would operate the ships in a more safe way, but probably not. Yeah. But you're right. I mean, one has to compare different industries, offshore and shipping, and within shipping there are different risks, different risk levels. And of course, a big accident nowadays with a big cruise ship would really be what we call a blow to the industry. It really would be a setback. People wouldn't like to go on board. I won't really go into this. I mentioned how important it is to be able to stay on board, that the ship should not be filled with water to the extent where it capsizes and turns upside down. So there's the SOLAS, that's what has to do with safety for people on board. That's international regulations, so you might as well learn SOLAS. And it's very easy to find on the web. But one can have sort of a safety index relating to the damage. This is an expression for the damage, and this damage factor has to be higher than a certain value R, and this R is related to number of lifeboats and number of persons on board, length of ship. Why is the length of ship important? Well, yes, but that too. But in this context, it's very simple. I mean, if you have a big ship, the possibility for being hit by another ship is much greater than if you have a small ship, right?
Yeah. In the same common sense, with some case, we calculate the probability of the communication by the subject cable. We calculate some of the parameters based on the by per kilometer, and then we combine the length total.
Yes, so there's certainly a size factor. So the chances for being hit in the fog by, let's say, a vessel where the captain has fallen asleep, he doesn't know what he's doing. You know, it's the larger the ship is, the probability gets to be higher. And of course, also the potential loss and your safety has to go up when you have many passengers. So it's kind of common sense. So this is this A factor that has to do with the vertical and length and penetration, which goes into that formula. But you should only know that this is a concept that is being used, and of course if you are hit in such a way that you have a very long penetration, not only is, the hole longer, but the probability for penetrating more compartments will be there, right? The longer the damage is, the more likely is that you will fill water into several compartments. So, you increase the size and you have to increase the safety standard. That makes sense. Here you see, and this is a good example. Here you see a Panmax size, right? It's just barely goes through here. And then, so that's the maximum size of a Panmax cruise ship. Freedom of the Seas, and now what we are seeing in the Genesis class. But I'm really wondering if this picture is correct, if it has only single skin here. In my opinion, it certainly should have a double skin in this zone. And it's interesting to compare, we're talking about safety of ships, and let's compare with the oil tanker. VLCC, very large crude carrier. Look at all the compartments here. The number of safety barriers, and of course these are absolutely watertight because they are oil tight, right? So, this is, and it's double bottom, double sides, all these bulkheads, thick plates. The fact is, it's almost impossible to sink a modern crude carrier. It's almost impossible. And in particular, if it's filled with oil, you can't sink it, because the oil is, of course, lighter than water. So, as such, oil tankers are safe. Of course, you may worry about fires and things like that, but in general, they are safe ships. But when you look at a cruise ship, very thin plates, and you like to have large openings, you utilize the space, people should be able to go through, etc. So, I certainly hope this is a double skin, but it doesn't really look like it, does it? Here's a double skin. I don't know. And of course, if you think about stability, just the fact that these are very, very, very high. The limit for these cruise ships that are built in Finland is that they have to go under a bridge. And I think the bridge height is, if I'm not wrong, it's about 58 meters. So that, 58 meters, that's pretty high. It's a really tall building. And then maybe you have a draft of 10 meters or so. You can wonder, can this be stable? Well, of course, the superstructure is typically built with aluminum to make it lighter. So the main hull, steel, superstructure, aluminum. And this is another one. Yeah, this is the one I had an arrow at. But this is a cruise ship that went between Sweden and Estonia. It's one of the Baltic countries, previously East Europe. And it sank during a winter storm, but it was not a particularly bad storm. But the captain went full speed, and it turned out that, this is a combined passenger car ferry, that this part of the ship had cracks. It had some fatigue cracks. And when first the waves broke off this is called the visor, that the bow part, it broke that one off. Then there's a next barrier, and when the big waves came into the ship, they broke that barrier too. And then you got water on the car deck, and it capsized. And this has also led to changes in regulations when it comes to car ferries. And can you imagine what the problem is? If you get water on the car deck, right? Here comes the waves and start filling water into the car deck. And if you take a flat tray with water and you fill it with a good deal of water, you know how difficult it is to hold it horizontally, because as soon as you start tilting it a little bit, what happens? Well, all the water runs to one side, right? So even though you don't have that much water, as soon as the ship starts rolling, all the water will go to, the wrong side, right? It will, and that is what can happen. And new regulations are very strict on making divisions. So you are not allowed to have, the full width of the deck as one car deck, or of the ship as one car deck. You have to divide it in the longitudinal direction. So there's much to learn from this. Fire zones. And this is typically what you have in a cruise ship. You have to have fire-safe walls, divide up, and this is exactly the concept of limiting the damage. Remember? We can't allow the whole ship to start burning, so you have these fire barriers, as you see here. And typically, in these big cruise ships, you have a big open mall. It's like a street that can be 100 and more than 100 meters, going 150 meters maybe, going through the ship. What do? Well, one has to have fire curtains that goes down and divides up this big mall that goes through the ship. So it's like a restaurant and shopping mall, and that has to be divided up in case a fire starts. And this is another accident. Ferry from Oslo to Copenhagen, and it was a pyromaniac, a person who set fire to it. It was an old ship. And even though, calm water, 1/3 of all the passengers on board died. A very serious accident. And again, that has led to stricter regulations. It's always very important to learn from accidents. Okay, I'll just end before we take a break now. Lifeboats. And typically you have to have these lifeboats along the ship side. In one way, it's kind of awkward because this is valuable space, you know. And you have to have all these lifeboats because there are regulations about the evacuation capacity. And typically, if you are going to go in a small boat in open and rough seas, you have to have a cover. Or you have a fleet, a raft, with a cover. Otherwise, it will be filled with water and maybe turned around. And also offshore technology, where you have these drop lifeboats, are now being used for ships, where you can launch a life raft where you can put the whole crew in here, and they sit inside, and it's dropped maybe 15-20 meters down into the sea. And of course, the people inside sit with their back towards the falling direction, because they're going to get a shock when this hits the water. Yeah, this is typically, you know, offshore. Just think what kind of dive this is. See this? But there has been some criticism lately about people say that they are not safe enough, this drop boat. There are quite a few of them made in Norway. Harding, it's called. So this is a critical issue. And there's an interest also in analyzing this. Just look at this entrance here. Huh? But people who go offshore, they have to go through a training course where they have to have this experience. So this is some simulations that were done in DNV, and this is kind of the right trajectory where you go in and you come up like that, and I guess this one goes down and just comes up again, and this one, does it come up in the air? I don't know. But anyway, hopefully it should kind of do a nice dive like that. And the purpose is not only that it should be as smooth as possible for the people on board, but the purpose is also to get away, right? Get away from the platform, get away from the ship, so you don't end up banging the lifeboat into the ship. Okay, I guess this is... Yeah, this is the last about the lifeboat. Talking about size. Look at this lifeboat, 370 persons. Yeah. So when you have 6,000 passengers and a crew of maybe 4,000, then we're talking about 10,000 people on board. Then, you cannot do that with lifeboats that take 20 persons. Then you need 500 lifeboats, right? So it's a big problem, and it's dangerous, So the concept, the ship is the safest lifeboat, certainly makes sense. Boats to a little bit about machinery. This is, I have a little bit of difficulties with this figure, because here it looks like we have double barrier, but this is deck 1 and deck 2, and there's not on deck 1. So I don't know. But anyway, machinery, that is, for this particular ship, you see it's what's called diesel electric. So you have here 6 diesel engines, and they have generators. Each has a generator making electricity, and the electricity is transferred to either, in this case, I'm not sure if it's a pod or just a shaft propeller, more traditional type. But in many cases, we are talking about these acipods, which are run by electric motors. But if you look,
you said that there is a multiple propulsion in cruise ship.
Yeah, there are two independent systems. So if one breaks down, the other one operates. But in some cases, there are three propellers. But these two, one belongs to three, and the other one belongs to the other three, and there should be a barrier between them. So they have to be, if one engine room is flooded, then the other one hopefully will not be flooded, because it's very dangerous for a cruise ship to lose power. You can imagine if you are close to shore and you lose power in a storm. Very, very severe. And I think this shows it better. This is another ship though, but you see here you have two separate chimneys. One is kind of brown colored and one is blue coming through the ship. And then you see two different engine rooms. One is brown and one is blue. And you see here is the cabling that goes to the pods. This one has three pods. It has two acipods that can rotate and one fixed pod. So there's full separation, and this is for reasons of safety. So if you have flooding, or let's say you have fire in the engine room, you will be able to have at least 50% power. Yeah.
What happens if there is flooded in between these two systems?
If it is
flooded between these
fire, but this is a firewall here. It's a firewall. It's maybe you don't see it as well, but it's, if you have fire in one engine room, it will not come into the other. So it's a full fire barrier between the two rooms. So that's what you need if you're going to have two independent systems. And even the cabling, you can have a fire that is destroying your cables. You have very high voltage electricity and insulation, and you see these fire ducts. No, I'm sorry. The cable ducts, they are completely separated. So I've been under one of these cruise ships in Finland, and I mean you don't get an impression of the dimensions, but it's big. So this is fixed, and these can rotate, and you see when you have this rotating and they are turned towards the direction of moving, these azimuthing acipods, as they're often called, they also work like rudders, right? So there's an electric motor inside here. Very compact, very complex technology. I think this may be one of the reasons also why Asia has some problems in competing in the cruise market. this is what the passenger sees. It's the cabin, right? That's the cabin. And it comes complete with a bathroom and electricity and TV, everything, is in that box. And the ship is made, you have these open decks, so they just push in these matchboxes that are prefabricated. So it's just to attach water and attach electricity, and there you go. Air conditioning, everything is in the box. And of course there are different sizes and different versions of this. And I would say the Finns are very, very good at this. These are not made in the shipyard. They are made in a special factory where they, mass produce these thousands of cabins, right? So they are just slit into the ship. One problem I've been working on at one time was trying to come up with a different type of deck structure in a cruise ship using sandwich. And the idea was really, now you have steel beams or aluminum beams, maybe of a height 30-40 centimeters, in these decks, these multiple decks. And of course, when you lose 30-40 centimeters per deck, if you could reduce the height of each deck to half, you can have another floor, another deck on the ship. And the value of that is tremendous. Understand what I'm saying? So instead of these different traditional deck structures in the superstructure, you try to reduce the height of the floors. And when you have 12 floors and you save 20 centimeters per floor, then of course you have an extra deck for the same height. And the value of that, that's what I'm saying, the value of that is very high. Then there's something called comfort class. Sounds pretty comfortable. But it has to do with general requirements. It has to do with noise and vibrations, indoor climate. And you can divide this into different comfort classes. And there are requirements as to what kind of noise level is accepted. And you can destroy a cruise ship by having noise and vibrations. It's that serious. If there is a lot of noise from the engine and the propellers, the passengers become very, very unhappy. So a ship that is not properly designed almost becomes useless. That's how important it is. And that's why you need some people who are very, very good at structural dynamics and acoustics in order to design and build a very good cruise ship. So it's not straightforward. So on most other types of ship, you are not too worried about this. The crew sort of has to take it. But a passenger who pays maybe several $1,000s for a trip on a cruise ship, he or she will not accept. And one other thing, in addition to the unpleasantness of having noise and vibrations, and one thing is noise in the air, but you also can have vibrations that you feel in the deck or through the floor. But it's really the rolling motion, right, of the ship that one is concerned about. I think down in the hall here you see some stabilizers in terms of you can fill water from one side to another. That you can do on a small ship, but I don't think that's a principle you can use for a large ship. What they do is they use these fins. You know, if you think of a whale, it's a big sea animal. You know, they use their flippers to control the motion. And these are systems that are dynamically controlled. And of course you have to have a very good control system where you know the characteristics of not only the ship but fortunately also the sea. So you can, when the ship is moving, you can move these flippers up and down and get a much more stable ride. And they can also be under the ship, but I guess it's better to have it on the sides. And this is a traditional way of doing it for a ship. It's called a bilge keel, and that is to reduce the rolling motion of a ship. So very many ships have that. This is much more expensive and advanced. You can see the mechanisms here. And you only have it for very expensive ships. Seasickness, and you know, I remembered from years back in DNV there was some research about seasickness where they had some students who volunteered to sit on a motion simulator. So they were sitting on the 6 degree of freedom motion simulator in the DNV laboratory, and you know, this motion simulator could simulate different sea states or motions of a ship. And so the students got, some of them got seasickness medication, and some others got also medication, but they were placebo. They were not real medicine, right? Like sugar pills or something like that. So the poor students were sitting on this motion simulator, and people recorded when they started breaking themselves, you know. So that was a scientific test. I tried to find these reports, and I know there are standards, and I really worked quite a bit on the internet, and I finally found a military paper from United States about motion sickness on warships, and you know why that is important. Of course, if the whole crew on a warship is lying sick, they are not very operable, right? So for combat preparedness, it's important to know that the crew on board are doing all right. And as you can see here, there is a frequency, and that is typically the roll frequency or the roll period, which is the opposite, 2 pi over frequency. And this is, one thing is, you know, the period or the frequency. The other one is how far is the amplitude, right? And of course, if you have a larger amplitude, then the accelerations are larger. So that's, you know, depending on the distance also from the rotation center. So here are different accelerations, and this is motion sickness indicator. And up here, up here you see 90% would be sick if you have a frequency of about is it 1 radian per second? So that's a period of 6 seconds, isn't it? So that is a typical sea state. So when the ship is rolling with this kind of frequency, almost everyone gets seasick. And this is another graph showing, how long does this seasickness last. So this is kind of average value. So it's normally worse during the 4-5 first hours, and that's, I guess, when you have something in your stomach. After that, you don't have anything in your stomach. And so, this index is typically going down. So one gets used to it. The body gets used to it. But, this is something also to know about if you design a ship. How it rolls and what kind of accelerations you get. And after all, there have to be people on board. So this is dynamics, and it's medicine. Yeah, so these are getting bigger and bigger, more and more fancy. 361 meters. These things are just enormous. You can't believe it until you have seen one of these things. And you see how they're built. So here, for instance, you see a big concert hall or theater. And I was in one cruise ship in Finland when they were building it. And the concert hall could take 1,200 people at the same time. It was as big as the main concert hall in the capital city of Helsinki. On the ship. It's just amazing, isn't it? So, and it is, of course, to build a ship like this is so much more complicated than building a bulk carrier or a crude carrier, right? You understand now when you've seen what this is? So it's not just to decide we'll build a cruise ship because we have 20 years of experience in building bulk and oil. Certainly a different business. And it requires a lot of skills and organization and capabilities. I'm not going to go through all of this. But remember, this is 225,000 tons gross. And displacement is 88,000. So, does it say anything about the draft is 30 feet? That's about 10 meters. Cruise speed 24 knots. 16 decks, can you imagine? 16 stories. 6,300 guests. Crew of 2,300. So, one has to exercise before doing this for the first time. An on-board experience. You have typically these big open malls. And again, this is where you have to close. In case of fire, you have to have these curtains that come down and divide up so you don't have a fire spreading. And you see these cabins here, they have windows towards the inside. But in a modern cruise ship, there's no cabin without a window to the outside or to the inside. People don't want that anymore. But in the old days, of course, you had cabins with windows, and then you had cabins without windows. I'm not sure if it looks like Disneyland, doesn't it? I'm not sure I like this. Well, anyway. There's obviously many people like this, and people live in cities and they don't mind living in the city when they are on the sea either. And of course there are so many things that one can do. So many activities. Sports, culture, eating, drinking, gambling. I think gambling would be great in Asia, right? The Chinese in particular. This is a Norwegian concept, world residency. And it's really, you buy an apartment and the ship moves around the world all the time. And one reason why this is attractive is that you don't pay taxes. You know, if your home address is on the ship. And with modern day communication, you know, you can do a lot of business also. And you can go off and you have your apartment there and you can come back. And or you can rent out your apartment for a given period of time. So there are new concepts. I think so far this is the only one. But typically, you know, it will go to places like where the Olympics is. Because these rich people who have apartments, they like to enjoy life and, for instance, be on the ship in their apartment and be able to go to the Olympics. But there are different types of passenger ships. Well, here is roll, roll on, roll off. Passenger car ferries, row packs, that is typical in addition to passengers and cars and trucks. You can have containers that are rolled on, and cruise ferries. Show you example of cruise ferries, and then you have the cruise ships. And this is, you know, delivery, the size of the ships being delivered. And the yellow ones, are they? Well, anyway, we are up here now in terms of gross tonnage. This is a very nice ferry that I have traveled on several times. It goes from Oslo to Kiel in Germany, and it's, you know, people when they go on vacation either from Germany to Norway or from Norway down to Germany and the European continent, you know, it's a nice trip that takes about, how many hours does it take? 18 hours or something like that. So you spend a night on board, and it's like a cruise ship. It's really incredible, the quality of that ship, and lots of entertainment and so on. So I wonder why you don't have something like that between Korea and Japan, for instance. That may be because you don't like to drive on the left-hand side, right? When you come to Japan. Isn't that left-hand driving? Gas LNG ferries. This is one in the Oslo fjord, goes to the center of Oslo from across the fjord. And you see passengers and cargo. This is something that is being discussed quite a bit, where you have a main hull and you have, in this case, it's what we call a trimaran. You know, a catamaran has 2 hulls. A trimaran has 3 hulls. That is, it's not really 3 hulls. It's 1 main hull, and then you have these 2 outriggers. And of course, those outriggers provide some extra space, but it also provides more stability when it comes to roll motion, right? And typically, one would be interested in this kind of design if you wanted to go fast. You know, going fast means that you have a long and narrow body of the ship. But if it's a narrow body, you know, it tends to roll more. And you can have like this, or in some cases, there have been designs for 5 pentamaran, 1 here and 1 in front, and similarly on the other side. So such concepts are being considered. Here you see one that is a trimaran, but also has some wind foils. And of course, when you have the wind foils, almost like sails, you need extra stability also in a more static way. So many things happening. This is a large mega yacht, which is owned by a Russian who owns Chelsea Football Club. Last summer it was very strange because I was in Bergen, city of Bergen in Norway. So he was there with his ship. Then I went back home in Oslo. He was there with his ship. Then I went down to southern France, where we have a place, and it was there too. It's almost like I was followed by this. This is interesting. This is a concept in the United States that I think they have used tens of millions of dollars, even more, to develop this concept called freedom ship. And I think the guy who came up with this concept and collected a lot of financing, you know, from people, he's now being sued. And why? Because it can be shown it cannot be built. You know, he has come up with this tremendous idea of a big cruise concept, and where he even can land airplanes on the roof, and got a lot of money to develop this concept, and then it turns out it's impossible. At least the way it has been designed, it is simply impossible to build. So he's like happens often in the United States, things end up in court, right? Being sued. So be a little bit careful with what you propose. Yeah, like Aker Yards and now SDX Europe done quite a bit of work on LNG, and we are going to see that in cruise ships too. So some gas turbines, and you see the electric generators, right? And this looks like a fixed shaft, but I'm sure it has pods as well. So this is the future, more environmentally friendly. So what are the priorities for a cruise? It's safety. We talked about fire, evacuation, and hull integrity. That is what we talked about. You know, if you have a collision and you make a hole in the hull, you know, what kind of rest strength and what kind of barriers do you have? Reliability and security. Keep schedule. People don't like to come to port one day late and their flight back home they missed. And of course, passenger security. They're talking about identification systems, and you know, nowadays also with this as a potential target for terrorism. Can imagine what kind of attention it would have if one of the big cruise ships was taken over by terrorists. Health. Avoidance of disease. There's one cruise ship that is, time after time, the passengers come back sick because they have not been able to disinfect the ship. Terrible. And motion sickness. Right? Silence, vibrations, entertainment. Regulatory compliance, of course, and should exceed the minimum requirements. So what are innovation needs? Building smarter, and we saw the complexity. I had this picture of a cruise ship under construction, and you can, I'm sure in your mind you remember what the oil tanker looked like. It's so different. New concepts, new onboard experience, mountain climbing, wakeboarding, new lifestyles, new destinations, Arctic, Asia, developing destinations in Asia, environmentally friendly ship, energy efficiency. So it's art and technology. So now the question is, if we can we do completely new types of ships? And this is something I've been interested in for some time, because I have been doing some studies on catamarans. And also been working on some particular structures within a catamaran ship. So the question is it possible to combine a catamaran design, which is today mainly used for fast, small vessels? Is it possible to use that for that kind of concept for a cruise ship? That could be a new type of ship altogether. And one of my students, Chanwok, so I gave him this master project, catamaran cruise ship. And you see this hull shape. Why do you think we have chosen this hull shape? Resistance, yes, it has to do with that, but it also has to do with motion. Because when you go with a rather high speed into a large wave, right, and you have a typical bow of a ship with a flare, what happens? It lifts up. In one way, that's good, of course. If you don't want water on the deck, but it gives you quite a bit of accelerations in the ship. You know, this kind of pitching motion. And of course also the hogging, if you can reduce the hogging resistance when you suddenly break up, you hit a big wave. So this is more what we call wave piercing. So when you have a big wave coming in here, it doesn't really lift up. But of course, you have to design for the fact that water comes over here, so you can't really use that deck area. But these are two completely separated hulls, and it's two completely separate superstructures. And then, of course, you have four sides with balconies and windows and all those things. And you have two slender bodies that have less resistance than a wide body large cruise ship, right? So the resistance and the energy efficiency will be better. And one of the things we discovered when we looked at not such big catamarans, but we looked for a scientific ship that was going to be built as a catamaran, and we did resistance calculations. And the interesting thing is that you can get interaction effects between the two hulls, which are just amazing, because if you take the resistance of one hull, right, and then of course when you have two hulls, you should think that the resistance is at least twice as much. But if there's a particular ratio between the width of the ship and the distance, you can actually see that the resistance is less than 2 times the resistance of one. So you have cancellation effects. When you set off the waves from each hull, there's a cancellation effect. And you can also do this in such a way that you in the resistance curve, you have a dip or a flat area in the area where you want to have the typical cruising speed. Very interesting. Jean-Luc, we talked about energy efficiency, and he put up some sails or wind foils here. I think what will be the answer is not this, but as you'll see, some kites that one can launch. But the planning of a ship, and this is a learning exercise, I think. Here he has a hotel function, 75%, ship function, passenger facilities, crew facilities, service facilities, task-related machinery, comfort system, air conditioning. You need some tank space. Very little outdoor deck, but you have that's just for mooring and things like that. But you have a large outdoor deck between the two hulls or superstructures. So this is how Jean-Luc has. He has an architect background, so he has tried to not just make some engineering boxes for the superstructure, but make it a little bit more interesting. He has separated, the passenger flow from the cruise flow and service flow, right? And then there are huge public spaces for activities in between here. But there's a problem, and that is when you have two hulls and you go in the sea and you have, let's say, waves from the side, you get what's called warping. One hull wants to go up like that and the other one wants to go down like that. And if you start calculating what kind of forces you get in the joining deck structure, it's tremendous forces, and that is what people have been worried about. But And this is something we showed in my project in DNV that we could handle by using a cellular structure for this combining deck. Very, very efficient and stiff deck structure. I won't go too much into details, but that can be done. So this is kind of impression between the two. You will have trees growing here. Nice lady too. So big open spaces, and of course one can have all sorts of activities. This is what you see here. Safety and evacuation. Of course, you cannot come up with a concept and be credible without showing that you have been thinking about safety and evacuation and so on. Different zones. I'm not sure if this is sufficient, to be quite frank. But anyway, it's, of course, it's divided up here, 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 here. Similarly there. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There are 10 different fire zones here. And evacuation. Yeah. Another interesting thing is, you can have your evacuation and lifeboats and, we also service vessels, possibly, hidden a little bit under the wet deck, and you just lower it in between the two hulls and come out that way. Of course, that has to be studied more carefully, but it's a completely different concept, isn't it? And you don't have the lifeboats at the most attractive locations that you typically have on a cruise ship. On the outside, that's prime space. Here, the lifeboats and the service vessels are hidden under. How that will work in a storm, it's, as I said, it has to be studied. This is something I think could be really spectacular with, this huge cruise ship. Very, very stable, very stiff in roll. Can you imagine if you could launch some very big kites from the ship, or one big kite? I'm sure all the passengers would like to see that. And, you can get quite significant power, provided, of course, it's blowing in the right direction. But these kites, they have, you see here, you see all the strings, and it's possible to maneuver these kites by remote control. So it's a rather sophisticated system. So I think in most conditions you can utilize the fact that it's blowing at sea. And of course, depending on how much it's blowing, you may have to adjust the size of the kite. I guess you cannot fly a big kite if it's a real storm. And this is another project that we had in DNV a couple of years ago, and that is the Cruise of the Future, environmentally friendly cruising. And these students, they had many ideas. Some were realistic, and some were not quite as realistic. Of course, running on, I think they plan to run it on hydrogen generated by wind power. But the most revolutionary in their concept was, and I'm not sure it makes too much sense, but anyway, it was an original idea, was that when you board the ship, you get your cabin, right? And it's like a drawer. It's prefabricated, right? So you are in this cabin, and then you go by the cruise ship to a destination, and in this case, the destination was a floating island. So you come in with your cruise ship, and then you unload all the cabins and put them into slots, similar slots in buildings or structures on this floating island. So you don't even have to leave your cabin, but your cabin is put into where you want to go, and when you go home again, they take the cabin. And well, it's creative, more creative probably than realistic. But there are many things that could be thought of for the future. So this gives you at least some background to start thinking in those terms. It's 5 minutes too long, but is it okay? Was it interesting? Okay.